Hello, I'm Michael Hainsworth. The Trump-era replacement for NAFTA, the Canada-US-Mexico agreement as we know it, is up for review. While it doesn't formally expire until 2036, a provision in the trade deal requires all three countries to review it 2 years from now. So why are we talking about it now?
This is Lawrence Herman, counsel at Herman and Associates and a C.D. Howe Institute senior fellow.
He has more than 5 decades under his belt as a trade lawyer, and today he's ringing the alarm bell.
I think the federal government needs to do more to engage the business community and to use the Canadian business community as, if you like, emissaries to meet with their American counterparts in the private sector, to convince their American counterparts of the importance of continuing the CUSMA and improving it where necessary.
When NAFTA was ripped up by Trump, the replacement deal led to a negotiated compromise that gives the U.S. the advantage. And Herman warns that the Americans will be putting things back on the table in the review that weren't settled earlier. And that has profound implications for Canada's trade and the economy on the whole. Larry joins us now. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
Is it going to take 2 years to prepare for a showdown?
Well, it may not take 2 full years, but I think we have to start thinking about it now. The reason being that there's a lot at stake, and I think that Canada has to be prepared, in fact, super prepared, to deal with the Americans in what is, Michael, is likely to be a rather rocky road when we review this agreement. It is not going to be a simple pro forma stamping of the deal. The deal, I believe, is going to be opened in some major ways, reopened in some major ways by the Americans, who are themselves gearing up for a pretty significant process of renegotiating major provisions of this agreement. So we need to start now. We need to get our act together now. You know, the clock is ticking, and before we know it, we'll be into this process. I think that it is important for us to start preparing now.
In what ways do you expect it to be reopened? I wonder if the stump speeches in the run-up to the U.S. presidential election in November will give us some insight into what the American lobbyists have been pushing the candidates to address.
There's a lot of things that the Americans are complaining about. Look, we have our own complaints. We have our own issues vis-a-vis the Americans and the Mexicans. We have to start putting these together and getting ready to put these on the table. But the Americans have a lot of complaints, and the indications are, from my knowledge of what's happening in Washington, is that the U.S. will want to renegotiate some provisions that they feel they gave away in the renegotiations. Now, we can go into this in a bit, Michael, if you like, but I don't think it's too difficult to predict what the Americans will want to put on the table. And Canada has to be prepared, not only defensively, but offensively in getting ready to put the Americans on the defensive, because look, we'll be into a horse trading exercise once this review starts.
Okay, so if it's not hard to predict what the Americans will have a problem with, maybe I'll try to predict something. You tell me what you think. Supply management in Canada's dairy sector has been a political hot potato for generations here. But didn't we recently win a ruling on tariffs placed on U.S. dairy entering Canada? Is that going to make life a little more difficult for our negotiators?
Well, you know, supply management will be on the table. There's no question about that. The dairy sector isn't large in terms of or relative to the total trade between Canada and the United States, but it is a lightning rod, and the American dairy sector does not like it. Don't forget, that's a sector, an industry that is largely concentrated in Wisconsin, a swing state, and so both Biden and Trump will be very responsive to the concerns of the U.S. dairy industry. We know that supply management and the restrictions on imports from the United States will be one of the issues that the Americans will raise. And I want to add something, Michael, which is very important. There is a bill now that's passed the House of Commons with a large majority, very few opposers in all parties. It's now in the Senate. And that bill, Bill C-282, amends the Global Affairs Act to prevent, by law, any negotiations by Canada on supply management. If that bill is approved by the Senate, and it looks like it's slowly going through the Senate process, likely to get out of the Senate before the next election, if that bill enters into law, it will be a very, very difficult process for Canada when we meet with the Americans. The Canadian negotiators will have to say, we can't talk about supply management because the law in Canada prevents us from doing so. I think that could be one of the most difficult issues when we deal with the Americans.
So the Americans would use it as a club.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that because, when you talk about international trade negotiations, whether it's Canada, US, and Mexico, or whether it's at the WTO, we're talking about balancing concessions. One side gives, the other side gives, and somewhere you reach a compromise and a deal is struck. If Canada says supply management is off the table, one of the responses would be, well, if you don't want to talk about supply management, we don't want to talk about X. Or if you want to talk, if you say you can't talk about supply management, then you've got to give up something in another area. I think the Canadian position on supply management will be very difficult for us when we start this review. And I'd like to talk about the review process for a bit so that people understand what's involved. I don't know whether you want to go into that now, but very briefly, without getting bogged down into legal technicalities, it might be worth explaining how the process will work.
Well, as I understand it, we've got not really a council of independent individuals deciding what the three countries can and cannot do. It's the three countries sitting down and the trade ministers representing each of those countries. So it's not exactly independent.
No, it isn't independent at all. It's a bit of a fiction, as I said in my piece for the C.D. Howe Institute. The Free Trade Commission is really the three governments. And so while you have this rather odd provision that the Commission will review the agreement to determine whether it should be extended, it's really the three governments sitting down and talking among themselves. So it's sort of smoke and mirrors. The three governments review the agreement to see whether it can be extended beyond 2036. And bear in mind, the way the agreement is written, it ends in 2036 unless the three governments agree to extend it. And in the process of review, the commission, so the three governments, receive submissions. Well, that is nothing less than a set of negotiations. The three governments will be exchanging views, exchanging positions on changing provisions of the agreement, adding provisions of the agreement. We're into, by all accounts, a renegotiation of the agreement. And in that process, any country, US, Mexico, Canada, can put on the table what they want to negotiate and what they want to see changed.
If I do recall, in 2018, Trump wanted the agreement to be like 5 or 6 years, which for any economy is an incredibly short time to have visibility about what your world is going to look like down the road. So we managed to make it 16, but it sounds like what you're telling me is he kind of got what he wanted after all, with 2026 being kind of a renegotiation period. But if it's just the three countries sitting down, couldn't Canada and Mexico overrule the United States? Is it a three-vote system? How would any negotiation on anything ultimately come to a conclusion?
Yeah, you raised a very good point. There are things in the agreement as it stands now, the CUSMA, the U.S. call it the USMCA. There are things that haven't been clarified. How is the process of review going to work? If we really are, for all intents and purposes, into a renegotiation, what are the parameters, the circumstances, the details of the process? My view is that these things need to be clarified so that the whole thing is well orchestrated and doesn't go off the rails. Bear in mind, the way it's written, the CUSMA ends in 2036 unless the three governments during this review process agree to continue it. Well, there are uncertainties, ambiguities, lack of clarity in the deal itself that need to be clarified. And my feeling is, and one of the reasons I think Canada and Mexico and the United States need to start thinking about this now, is that there is a need for all three governments to clarify how the process will work, to add to some of the details that are left out in the agreement so the whole thing is well managed, doesn't go off the rails, that we don't enter into an area of great uncertainty for the business community while the review process unfolds. And my suggestion is that there should be a protocol agreed to by the three governments, setting out the process, making it clear, putting some time limits there, and possibly setting out a category of those parts of the provisions that work well and that could be adjusted and made better. And then another set of categories setting out where the agreement needs to be reopened, where things need to be changed. In other words, I'm talking about a separate agreement, a protocol, if you like, which clarifies how the process will work so that we don't have uncertainties, lack of clarity in the trading relationship.
Okay, so if I understand this correctly, we're going into this um, in a position of weakness and uncertainty about the process in and to itself. To your point, the dairy component to this, it's only 3.5% access to our market, and we're not even giving them that. But that will tie one hand behind the backs of Canadian negotiators. I wonder if we're going into this with both hands tied behind our backs, because we started 2024 with a retroactive digital services tax on non-Canadian businesses like Netflix. How are the Americans expected to respond, considering that is a substantially bigger part of both our economies than dairy?
Well, couple of things I might say. First of all, that will be a big issue. It isn't necessarily going to be unresolvable. I think the parties can come to some agreement on how this is going to work going forward. But I question your premise. I don't think Canada is necessarily going into these negotiations or this review from a position of weakness. We have a lot of strengths, and that is why I think we need to make sure the process is well run, well orchestrated, and unfolds in an orderly way. For example, the Americans are very keen on dealing with China. They're very keen on ensuring security of supply, that supply chains are secure, that there is an agreement whereby Canada, US, and Mexico will enter into secure critical mineral supplies and other critical components of EVs and a whole range of other things. These are where Canada has a strength, and where Canada now should be talking to the Americans and the Mexicans about those parts of the agreement where the three countries have common objectives and where the agreement could be improved. I don't think we go into it from a position of weakness. We go into it knowing that there are some difficult issues, that the Americans will be very tough. But I think Canada has many strengths to put on the table, many strong points, and we should be now organizing ourselves to maximize the leverage we do have.
So, what do we need to do beyond essentially a 2-year charm offensive by Canadian politicians and business leaders?
Well, I think the charm offensive, if you want to call it that, it is very important. I believe that the business community must be better engaged, more engaged, more fully engaged in this process. I think the federal government needs to do more to engage the business community and to use the Canadian business community as, if you like, emissaries to meet with their American counterparts in the private sector, to convince their American counterparts of the importance of continuing the CUSMA and improving it where necessary. But the private sector involvement is critical. And I don't think Canada, or if I may put it this way, I don't think the federal government has been doing enough to enlist the advantages of the business community in meeting with their U.S. counterparts. So that's something I put on the table as very, very crucial. It's not just governments to governments. The agreement involves business arrangements, commercial arrangements, and this is where I think we have to do a better job to make sure that the American business community understands why this agreement is important, why it has to be continued, where it can be improved, and for heaven's sakes, not letting all kinds of uncertainties unfold, and with the suggestion that the agreement will come to an end in 2036.
The Europeans have formal trade and advisory councils. The Americans have more than 30 of them. It's inconceivable to me that Canada has approached this on an ad hoc basis, and you and I have to have this conversation.
Exactly. I think that is where we need to do much better. And I think it's up to the federal government to take steps to create business advisory committees in various sectors, particularly the critical sectors, critical minerals being one, but high-tech industries being another, areas where Canadian business can have an influence in convincing their American counterparts to put pressure on Washington, on the decision makers in Washington, to continue this agreement as long as possible. I mean, business, as we know, Michael, needs a framework of security and certainty, stability, predictability. We can't allow the agreement to unfold in an uncoordinated and unorganized way, with negotiations going in all kinds of different directions over the next number of years. We need, coming back to what I said earlier, we need to have the three governments settle the process to make sure that the review and the renegotiation unfolds in an orderly way, or at least as orderly as possible.
Canada appeared to punch above its weight at the negotiating table in 2018. Are you confident we can do so again?
I think we can do so, but I think it's going to take more effort. We did very well in those negotiations, but these were the product, in a sense, of ad hoc arrangements with the business community. My call, my approach is to call on the government to get organized with the business community, have advisory committees established now, getting the Canadian private sector engaged in this process now. It takes time to put these committees and advisor groups together. The review is going to start in earnest at the end of next year, really 18 months from now, when we start hearing about what the American position is in detail. And I think we've got to be prepared. Preparation is critical.
Is this conversation moot if Donald Trump gets back into the White House?
I don't think it's moot at all. I think it actually focuses the possibility, focuses our attention on the possibility of a new regime in Washington. If we start now, we put the process in place now, get it working now, then hopefully whatever structures the three governments agree on now to organize the review will survive the changes in government. The Mexicans will have a new government in office as of October. There'll be a Canadian election before the review starts. The Americans will have a new administration. But I think that if the processes are well developed now, when I talk about the processes, I mean the review processes, how it's going to be managed and how it will unfold. If we get those together now, those should survive changes of government, which would add to the certainty or to the stability in the review process. And these things, I think, need to be worked on now. Look, Canada has to get organized itself. But even if Canada is organized, getting the Americans and the Mexicans in the picture, getting them to be organized so that there's a three-country approach to this, it does take time. And that's why I say we have to start work on this now. It's urgent and it's critical.
Larry, it's always great speaking with you. Thank you for your time and insight.
You're welcome, Michael.
Lawrence Herman is a counsel at Herman and Associates and a C.D. Howe Institute Senior Fellow.
I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to the C.D. Howe Institute podcast with Michael Hainsworth. Subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. The C.D. Howe Institute is an independent, not-for-profit research institute whose mission is to raise living standards by fostering economically sound public policies. The Institute is widely considered to be Canada's most influential think tank and a trusted source of essential policy intelligence, distinguished by nonpartisan, evidence-based research and subject to definitive expert review. Visit cdhow.org and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you.